the 5th of October 1851, somewhere in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The morning light slanted through the window of a modest workshop on Chestnut Street, casting long shadows across rough wooden planks and carpenter's tools. The smell of fresh pine shavings mingled with something sweeter, the faint golden scent of beeswax drifting in from the small apiary behind the building. Lorenzo Langstroth, aged 41, stood with both hands gripping the edge of a wooden frame, his eyes fixed on the precise gap he had measured and remeasured 100 times. 3/8 of an inch, no more, no less. Bees hummed softly in the background, their gentle drone, a familiar companion to his thoughts. In that moment, he looked not like a minister who had forsaken his pulpit, but like a man who had discovered something the world didn't yet know it needed. He ran his finger along the smooth wood of the frame, then carefully lowered it into the hive box. The frames slid perfectly, suspended in air, each one maintaining that crucial distance from its neighbor. His voice, weakened from years of battling the darkness in his own mind, broke the silence. "They can move freely," he whispered to himself. "They won't seal it shut. They won't bind it together." Behind him, Philadelphia's bustling streets carried on with their daily commerce. Horse-drawn carts clattered past. Street vendors called out their wares. Factory whistles blew. But none of them understood what was happening in this small workshop. None of them could have known that this simple wooden box with its movable frames would one day help feed an army. Langstroth didn't wave to the passing crowds. He didn't shout his discovery from the rooftops. He just stood there, staring at his creation, fighting back the familiar weight of doubt that always threatened to pull him under. There was no one to celebrate with. Not yet. His invention felt like another world, one that existed only in his hands and in his troubled mind. But he was wrong about its insignificance, dead wrong, because in 91 years, millions upon millions of pounds of honey produced by hives based on his design would sustain American soldiers fighting across 2 oceans. They called him peculiar, unstable, just a broken minister playing with bees, until his trick with frames helped change the face of agriculture, of warfare, of survival itself. The minister, the bees, and the war. Lorenzo Langstroth was not a hero by any conventional standard. He was a minister, a teacher, a beekeeper, and like many men of his time, he struggled with demons that had no name in the 1800s. Born on Christmas Day, 1810, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he was the second of 8 children in a family of English descent. Even as a boy, he showed an obsessive interest in insects, spending hours on his knees on the gravel walkways outside his home, studying ants with the intensity of a natural philosopher. His father once whipped him for wearing holes in the knees of his pants from too much kneeling, too much observation, too much fascination with creatures most people simply crushed underfoot. But young Lorenzo couldn't help himself. The orderly world of insects, their purposeful movements, their structured societies, offered him something his own mind often couldn't provide: stability. He graduated from Yale College in 1831 with a degree in theology. The ministry seemed a natural path for a young man of learning and moral character. He held a tutorship at Yale from 1834 to 1835, then accepted positions as pastor at various congregational churches across Massachusetts. In May of 1836, he became pastor of the South Congregational Church in Andover, Massachusetts. That same year, he married Ann Tucker, a woman who would become his anchor through the storms ahead. But even with a loving wife and a respectable position, something was wrong. Langstroth suffered from what he called head troubles, debilitating episodes of depression that would strike without warning and leave him unable to function for weeks or even months at a time. In an era that had no understanding of mental illness, no medications, no therapy, he was left to fight these battles alone in darkened rooms, playing chess against himself, fasting for days, struggling to maintain his grip on sanity. The attacks were unpredictable and devastating. He would lock himself away, unable to preach, unable to work, barely able to speak. His congregation didn't understand. How could a man of God, a man who preached hope and faith, be so consumed by darkness? In 1843, his condition forced him to resign from his pastoral position. He was 33 years old, and his calling as a minister seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. But in 1838, something happened that would change everything. While visiting a friend, Langstroth noticed a glass jar filled with honeycomb sitting on a table. The sight sparked something inside him, a flicker of the childhood curiosity that had never truly died. His friend kept bees in the attic of his house, and when Langstroth asked to see them, he was instantly captivated. The ordered complexity of the hive, the purposeful work of thousands of individual bees functioning as one organism, spoke to him in a way nothing else could. He returned home that very day and purchased 2 colonies of his own. From that moment forward, beekeeping became more than a hobby. It became his lifeline. When the darkness descended, when his mind threatened to betray him, he could go to his bees. Their steady work, their unwavering purpose, their complete indifference to his suffering, gave him something to hold on to. The bees didn't judge him. They didn't question his faith or his sanity. They just worked, day after day, building comb, storing honey, raising brood, as they had done for millions of years. By 1848, Langstroth had moved his family to Philadelphia, where he accepted a position as principal of a young ladies' school. It was less demanding than parish ministry and gave him time to pursue his growing obsession with bees. He set up a 2-acre apiary in West Philadelphia and began studying every aspect of hive management. He read everything he could find on the subject. He studied the work of François Huber, the blind Swiss naturalist who had revolutionized understanding of bee behavior. He corresponded with other beekeepers, learning about European innovations and experimenting with different hive designs. But there was a fundamental problem with every hive design he encountered. Whether they were traditional straw skeps, hollowed log gums, or wooden box hives, they all shared one critical flaw: the bees cemented everything together. They filled every gap with propolis, a sticky resin they collected from tree buds. They built comb that attached to the walls, to the floor, to the lid. Harvesting honey meant cutting out the comb, destroying the bees' work, and often killing many bees in the process. Managing the colony required disturbing it so severely that the bees became aggressive and dangerous. Beekeeping in the mid-1800s was a destructive practice. Most beekeepers simply killed their colonies each fall with burning sulfur, cut out the honey, and started over with new swarms the following spring. It was wasteful, inefficient, and cruel. But what choice did they have? The bees themselves determined what could and couldn't be done. Langstroth knew there had to be a better way. He had read about François Huber's leaf hive, which used movable frames arranged like pages in a book. It was an elegant idea, but it had never caught on, probably because it was side-opening and awkward to manage. Other inventors had tried various approaches, but none had solved the fundamental problem: how to create spaces that bees would leave open, allowing frames to be removed without cutting comb or crushing bees. Then, in the summer of 1851, while working in his Philadelphia apiary, Langstroth had his breakthrough. He was attempting to remove the flat wooden coverboard from one of his experimental hives when he noticed something remarkable. The cover came off easily, far more easily than usual. He examined the space between the top of the frames and the coverboard. It measured approximately 3/8 of an inch, maybe slightly less. The bees had left it completely open. No propolis, no burr comb, just clear, passable space. His heart began to race. This was it. This was the answer. He later described that moment in his reminiscences, returning late in the afternoon from the apiary which I had established some 2 miles from my city home, and pondering as I walked along, the almost self-evident idea of using the same bee space came into my mind, and in a moment the suspended movable frames, kept at a suitable distance from each other and the case containing them, came into being. I could scarcely refrain from shouting out my eureka in the open streets. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Bees needed a minimum amount of space to move through the hive. If you gave them less than approximately 1/4 inch, they would fill it with propolis to seal it shut. If you gave them more than approximately 3/8 of an inch, they would build comb in it. But if you maintained that precise gap, that bee space, they would leave it open. By designing a hive where every component, every frame, every wall, every surface, was separated from its neighbors by bee space, You could create a hive where nothing was cemented together. Frames could slide out like drawers. The beekeeper could inspect the colony, harvest honey, check for disease, manipulate the brood, even move entire frames from one hive to another, all without destroying the comb or seriously disturbing the bees. Working with Philadelphia cabinet maker Henry Borkin, a fellow bee enthusiast who understood both woodworking and the needs of beekeepers, Langstroth began constructing his revolutionary hive. The design was deceptively simple: a rectangular wooden box, open at the bottom, with wooden frames suspended from a rabbet, a groove cut into the top edge of the box walls. Each frame hung vertically, parallel to its neighbors, separated by bee space. The top of each frame was separated from the coverboard above by bee space. The bottom and sides of each frame were separated from the floor and walls of the hive by bee space. Multiple boxes could be stacked on top of each other, again separated by bee space. The queen could be confined to the lower boxes using a metal grate called a queen excluder, which allowed workers to pass through but kept the larger queen below. This meant honey could be stored in the upper boxes without contamination from brood. On the 5th of October 1851, Lorenzo Langstroth received United States patent number 9300 for his movable frame beehive. He was 41 years old. By that time, he had constructed over 100 of these hives and had seen firsthand how transformative the design was. Honey production increased dramatically because bees didn't have to rebuild comb after each harvest. Colony health improved because beekeepers could actually see what was happening inside the hive and address problems before they became catastrophic. Bee survival rates went up because the harvest no longer required destroying the colony. Langstroth poured his knowledge into a book, initially titled A Practical Treatise on the Hive and Honeybee, published in 1853. It would eventually be known simply as Langstroth on the Hive and the Honeybee, and would become the foundational text of American beekeeping. In it, he detailed not just the construction of his hive, but the biology of bees, their behavior, their diseases, and the best practices for managing them. It was part technical manual, part natural history, part philosophical, meditation on the wonder of these remarkable insects. The book was an immediate success among beekeepers, going through dozens of editions and being translated into multiple languages. But Langstroth himself never profited from his invention. His patent was widely violated. Other inventors made minor modifications and claimed their designs were different enough to avoid infringement. Langstroth lacked the resources and the mental stamina to defend his patent in court. The legal battles he did attempt left him drained and bitter. By the 1860s, hundreds of beekeepers across America were using some variation of the Langstroth hive, but few of them paid him a single cent in royalties. His financial situation grew desperate. His health continued to deteriorate. The episodes of depression came more frequently and lasted longer. Yet he continued to work with his bees, continued to write, continued to refine his understanding. In 1858, he moved with his wife, their 3 children, and his widowed mother to Oxford, Ohio, where he had purchased a 10-acre property perfect for beekeeping. He planted linden trees along the street, apple trees throughout the property, and sowed buckwheat and clover, creating what he called his honey garden. There, despite his ongoing struggles with mental illness and financial hardship, he made another significant contribution to American beekeeping, the importation and propagation of Italian honeybees. Before Langstroth, American beekeepers relied primarily on the common European dark bee, a hardy but relatively unproductive subspecies. Italian bees, Apis mellifera ligustica, were known in Europe to be gentler, more productive, and better at defending themselves against certain pests. In 1863, Langstroth received his first shipment of Italian bees, making him one of the first American beekeepers to successfully import and breed them. Working with his son James, he began selling Italian queen bees to other beekeepers at $20 each. In 1 year alone, they sold 100 queens, many sent by post to destinations across the United States. This work helped transform American beekeeping, making it more productive and accessible. But for Langstroth, it was never about the money or the recognition. It was about the bees themselves, about losing himself in their perfect, ordered world. about finding peace in their ceaseless industry. His wife Anne died in January of 1873, the same year his mother passed. Both were buried in Oxford Cemetery. The losses devastated him. For the next 14 years, he continued living in Oxford, increasingly isolated, his depressions becoming more severe and more frequent. By 1887, he could no longer manage on his own and moved to Dayton, Ohio, to live with his daughter. He rarely spoke of bees anymore. He seemed to have retreated entirely into himself, but the impact of his work continued to spread. By the 1880s, the vast majority of American beekeepers were using some form of the Langstroth hive. Commercial honey production, once a marginal enterprise, had become a significant agricultural industry. Beekeepers could now manage dozens or even hundreds of hives, producing thousands of pounds of honey each year. The movable frame design allowed for a level of efficiency and productivity that had been unimaginable with the old skeps and gums. Bees could be managed, bred, moved, and maintained in ways that previous generations of beekeepers could only dream of. The American honey industry began to grow rapidly, transforming from a cottage industry into a commercial enterprise. And all of it traced back to that moment in 1851 when a troubled minister noticed a 3/8-inch gap that bees had left perfectly open. On October 6, 1895, at the age of 84, Lorenzo Langstroth collapsed and died while giving a sermon at Wayne Avenue Presbyterian Church in Dayton. He was preaching about the love of God. It was a fitting end for a man who had never truly left the ministry, who had found divinity in the ordered complexity of a beehive, who had sought salvation in the company of bees. He was buried in Woodland Cemetery in Dayton. His gravestone, paid for by grateful beekeepers from across the nation, bears this inscription: "Inscribed to the memory of Reverend L. Langstroth, father of American beekeeping, by his affectionate beneficiaries who, in the remembrance of the service rendered by his persistent and painstaking observations and experiments with the honeybee, his improvements in the hive, and the literary ability shown in the first scientific and popular book on the subject of beekeeping in the United States, gratefully erect this monument." But his story didn't end in 1895. The full measure of his contribution wouldn't become clear for another half-century. Because when the world went to war again, when millions of soldiers needed to be fed and sustained across two vast oceans, when sugar became scarce and alternatives were desperately needed, it was Langstroth's invention that made large-scale honey production possible. The war that would validate everything. December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Within days, the United States declared war on Japan and Germany, and the nation's entire industrial and agricultural capacity began redirecting toward the war effort. Every resource, every factory, every farm, every worker was suddenly viewed through the lens of military necessity. Could it help win the war? Could it feed soldiers? Could it give America an advantage over its enemies? The answer, in almost every case, was yes. Factories that had made automobiles began making tanks and aircraft. Farms that had grown a variety of crops began focusing on whatever the military needed most. Women entered the workforce by the millions to replace men who had gone to fight. The entire nation became a war machine, and nothing was exempt from conscription, including honeybees. But to understand how bees became essential to the war effort, you need to understand what was happening with food production across America in the early 1940s. The Great Depression had only ended a few years earlier, and many farms were still recovering from a decade of economic devastation. The Dust Bowl had destroyed agricultural capacity across the Great Plains. Farmers who had barely survived the Depression now faced the prospect of sending their sons to war while dramatically increasing production. The government created the War Food Administration, tasked with coordinating agricultural production to meet both civilian needs and military demands. They set quotas for everything: wheat, corn, soybeans, beef, pork, chicken, eggs, milk, vegetables. Every single agricultural product was counted, measured, and allocated according to military necessity. At first, honey wasn't on that list. It was considered a luxury, a treat, something nice to have but not essential to survival or victory. But that assessment would change quickly. The scale of what America needed to accomplish was staggering. The military was expanding from under 400,000 active duty personnel in 1940 to over 16 million by 1945. That's 16 million people who needed to be fed 3 meals a day, every single day, no matter where they were serving. Add to that the fact that America was supplying food not just to its own forces, but also to allied nations whose agricultural capacity had been devastated by war. Britain was importing 70% of its food before the war, and German U-boats were sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate. The Soviet Union was losing vast agricultural regions to German invasion. China was fighting both a civil war and a war with Japan. All of them needed American food. The logistics were nightmarish. How do you feed millions of soldiers fighting in the jungles of New Guinea, where the heat and humidity spoil food in days? How do you supply troops in North Africa, where temperatures can reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade? How do you keep sailors fed on ships that might spend months at sea without reaching port? The answer was shelf-stable, energy-dense foods that could survive extreme conditions. Canned goods, dried foods, hardtack, K-rations, C-rations, and sweeteners that wouldn't spoil, wouldn't ferment, and wouldn't require refrigeration. That meant honey. Honey producers across the nation received letters informing them that their work was now considered critical to national defense. It seemed almost absurd. How could bees, those tiny insects producing sweet golden syrup for breakfast toast, possibly be essential to winning a global war? But the government knew something that most civilians didn't understand. War is won not just with bullets and bombs, but with calories, with energy, with the ability to keep soldiers fed and functioning under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And in 1942, sugar, the primary sweetener in the American diet, was in desperately short supply. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines cut off the United States from its largest source of sugar cane, which had supplied nearly 20% of America's sugar. German U-boats prowling the Atlantic attacked merchant ships carrying sugar from the Caribbean. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 500 Allied merchant ships. Each ship that went down represented not just lost lives but lost cargo, sugar, fuel, weapons, food. In April of 1942, the government instituted strict sugar rationing. It was the first food item to be rationed in the United States during World War II, implemented even before meat, butter, or coffee. Each American citizen was limited to 8 ounces of sugar per week, roughly 26 pounds per year, down from 100 pounds before the war. That's a 74% reduction in sugar consumption overnight. Families registered at their local schools to receive ration books. Each person, including children, got their own book filled with stamps. Each stamp was initially worth 1 pound of sugar and had to be used within a specific 2-week period. Later, the Office of Price Administration adjusted the system, so each stamp was worth 2 pounds, but lasted for a month. The system was complex, bureaucratic, and deeply unpopular, but it was necessary. Sugar wasn't just used for sweetening coffee and baking cakes. It was essential for preserving food. Before refrigeration became widespread, canning and preserving with sugar was how families stored fruit and vegetables for the winter. Without adequate sugar, food preservation became nearly impossible for many families. Sugar was needed for making certain explosives. The manufacturing of glycerin, a key component in nitroglycerin, required large quantities of sugar or sugar-based materials. Sugar was needed for producing certain medications. It was used in pharmaceutical production, in IV solutions, in various medical applications that soldiers desperately needed. Sugar was essential for maintaining morale. Chocolate bars, candies, sweet treats, these weren't luxuries for soldiers facing death. They were psychological necessities, small reminders of home, brief moments of pleasure in the midst of horror. The military needed vast quantities of sugar, which meant civilians would have to make do with much less. They turned to substitutes: corn syrup, molasses, maple syrup, and honey. Lots and lots of honey. But even as demand for honey skyrocketed, there was skepticism. Could American beekeepers really increase production enough to make a difference? Were bees actually capable of replacing sugar on any meaningful scale? The Department of Agriculture brought in experts to assess the situation. They consulted with commercial beekeepers, with agricultural scientists, with nutritionists and logistics specialists. What they discovered was both encouraging and daunting. The encouraging part: American beekeepers in 1941 were already producing approximately 150 million pounds of honey per year. That was a significant amount, enough to provide roughly £1 per person per year if distributed evenly across the population. With the right incentives and support, production could potentially be increased by 20 to 30% within a year or two. The daunting part: to truly replace the lost sugar, honey production would need to increase by hundreds of percent, not just 20 or 30. That level of expansion would require massive investment, more beekeepers, more hives, more equipment, and more land dedicated to bee-friendly crops. It would take years to achieve, years the nation didn't have. So the government took a pragmatic approach. They wouldn't try to replace all the lost sugar with honey. Instead, they would increase honey production as much as possible and use it strategically, where it made the most sense. For the military, honey had advantages that made it ideal for certain applications, advantages that sugar simply couldn't match. Sugar wasn't just used for sweetening coffee and baking cakes. It was essential for preserving food, for making explosives, for producing certain medications, for maintaining morale. The military needed vast quantities of it, which meant civilians would have to make do with much less. They turned to substitutes: corn syrup, molasses, maple syrup, and honey. Lots and lots of honey. Honey had several advantages over other sweeteners. It was shelf-stable, requiring no refrigeration even in extreme heat. Unlike sugar, which could clump in humidity or melt in high temperatures, honey maintained its consistency across a wide range of conditions. Soldiers in the Pacific Islands, where humidity regularly exceeded 80% and temperatures stayed above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, found that honey remained usable when sugar had turned into a sticky, unusable mess. Honey offered unique military advantages. It's energy-dense, providing 64 calories per tablespoon compared to 48 for sugar, with fructose and glucose rapidly absorbed by the body for immediate energy. For soldiers engaged in intense physical activity, this could mean the difference between alertness and exhaustion. It has antimicrobial properties. Honey's high sugar concentration and low pH create an environment hostile to bacteria, while enzymes produce natural hydrogen peroxide. Field hospitals from New Guinea to North Africa kept medical-grade honey for treating burns and wounds when antibiotics weren't available. Most critically, honey never spoils. Unlike most foods that degrade over weeks or months, honey could be loaded onto a transport ship in California, spend months at sea, sit in a supply depot in Australia, then reach forward bases in the Philippines still perfectly usable. That durability was invaluable in a war fought across tens of thousands of miles. But there was a problem. American honey production in 1941, while substantial, wasn't nearly enough to replace the sugar that was now being diverted to military use. The country needed more honey, much more, and it needed it fast. The Department of Agriculture set an ambitious goal: increase honey production by 20% in 1942 alone. That might not sound like much, but consider what it meant in practical terms. In 1941, there were approximately 4.5 million bee colonies in the United States producing honey. To increase production by 20%, beekeepers would need to either add more colonies, improve the productivity of existing colonies, or both. Adding colonies meant catching swarms, breeding queens, building more hives, and finding more locations with adequate bee forage. Improving productivity meant better disease management, better timing of honey flows, better equipment, and most importantly, more efficient hive designs. This is where Langstroth's invention, now 90 years old, became absolutely critical to the war effort, because without movable frame hives, the kind of large-scale, efficient honey production the nation needed would have been completely impossible. Think about it. Really think about what beekeeping was like before Langstroth. For thousands of years, humans had kept bees in essentially the same way. You provided them with an enclosure, a skep woven from straw, a hollow log, a clay vessel, a wooden box, and the bees built their comb inside however they wanted. They attached the comb to the walls, to the top, to the bottom, cementing everything together with propolis. When you wanted honey, you had two choices. Choice 1. Kill the bees. This was the traditional method used for millennia. In the fall, after the bees had filled their hive with honey, you would place the hive over a pit of burning sulfur, brimstone. The sulfur fumes would kill every bee in the colony within minutes. Then you would cut out the honeycomb, crush it, strain the honey, and melt down the wax. The hive, now empty and reeking of death, would wait until spring when you might catch a swarm to start the cycle over again. This method was brutal, inefficient, and fundamentally destructive. You killed millions of bees every year. You destroyed all the comb they had built, comb that represented thousands of hours of work and significant amounts of bee-produced wax. You had no ability to manage diseases, to improve genetics, to maintain productive colonies from year to year, and your production was strictly limited by how many swarms you could capture each spring. Choice 2. Cut out some comb without killing the bees. This was theoretically better but practically just as problematic. You would smoke the hive to calm the bees, then use a knife to cut away sections of comb that contained honey. The problem? The comb was attached to everything. Cutting it meant damaging the hive structure, disturbing the brood, enraging the bees, and generally creating chaos. You couldn't see what you were cutting. You couldn't tell if you were destroying eggs, larvae, or pupae. You couldn't avoid cutting through brood comb to get to honey. You couldn't remove empty comb and reuse it. And the bees, understandably upset by having their home torn apart, would often abscond, abandoning the hive entirely and leaving you with nothing. Both methods meant that beekeepers in the pre-Langstroth era could only manage a handful of hives, 10, maybe 20 if you were really dedicated. Anything more, and you simply couldn't keep up with the destruction and reconstruction required each season. Production per hive was low because the bees spent most of their energy rebuilding comb that had been destroyed rather than filling comb with honey. Colony survival was poor because diseased hives couldn't be identified and treated. Genetic improvement was impossible because you couldn't control which queens mated with which drones, and the entire enterprise was more of a hobby or sideline than a serious agricultural business. Now consider what Langstroth's movable frame hive changed. Instead of fixed comb attached to everything, you had comb built on wooden frames that could be individually removed, inspected, and replaced. Instead of killing bees to harvest honey, you simply lifted out frames full of honey, extracted it using a centrifugal extractor that spun the honey out without damaging the comb, and returned the empty frames to the hive for the bees to refill. The bees didn't have to rebuild comb. They could immediately start filling the existing comb with more honey. This meant production per hive could be tripled or even quadrupled compared to traditional methods. Instead of managing 10 or 20 hives with destructive methods, a single beekeeper could now manage 100, 200, even 500 hives, checking them regularly, harvesting multiple times per season, maintaining healthy colonies year after year. Instead of relying on wild swarms to replenish your colonies each spring, you could breed your own queens, split strong colonies to create new ones, and maintain complete control over your breeding stock. Instead of having no idea what was happening inside your hives until you destroyed them, you could open them at any time, inspect every frame, spot diseases early, treat problems before they became catastrophic, and actively manage the health of your colonies. The transformation was so complete, so revolutionary, that by the 1940s, old-style beekeeping had virtually disappeared in America. Every commercial beekeeper, and most hobbyists, used some variation of the Langstroth hive. Not because of any government mandate or regulation, but because it simply worked better than anything else. The efficiency gains were so dramatic that there was no reason to use anything else. The country needed more honey, much more, and it needed it fast. The Department of Agriculture set an ambitious goal: increase honey production by 20% in 1940, 2 alone. That meant beekeepers needed to expand their operations, increase their colony counts, improve their yields, and do it all while many of their workers were being drafted into military service. This is where Langstroth's invention became absolutely critical. because without movable frame hives, large-scale honey production would have been impossible. Think about it. The old methods of beekeeping, the skeps and gums and fixed comb hives that Langstroth had sought to replace, required killing the bees to harvest honey. A beekeeper might maintain a dozen or so hives, killing them each fall and hoping to capture swarms the following spring to replenish their stock. Production was limited by how many swarms you could capture and how many hives you could manage before the fall slaughter. But with Langstroth hives, everything changed. A single beekeeper could manage hundreds of hives, harvesting honey multiple times per year without harming the bees. Frames could be moved from strong colonies to weak ones. Queens could be bred and replaced. Diseases could be spotted and treated. The entire operation could be scaled up in ways that would have been unthinkable in Langstroth's time. By the 1940s, commercial beekeepers in the United States were managing thousands of hives, producing hundreds of thousands of pounds of honey each year. Some operations in California, the Dakotas, and other honey-producing regions were even larger. And it all depended on the movable frame design that a depressed minister in Philadelphia had invented 90 years earlier. The government knew this. They knew that modern beekeeping, and thus the honey production the nation desperately needed, was built entirely on Langstroth's innovation. So when they declared beekeeping a war-essential industry, they weren't just talking about honey. They were talking about the infrastructure, the knowledge base, the equipment, and the genetic stock, the Italian bees that Langstroth had imported, that made modern beekeeping possible. Beekeepers responded to the call. Across the nation, operations expanded. Hives multiplied. Production soared. By 1943, American beekeepers were producing over 200 million pounds of honey per year, a 30% increase from pre-war levels. Much of this honey went directly to the military. It was canned, labeled as Army issue or Navy issue, and shipped to wherever American forces were fighting. Soldiers in the Pacific Islands ate honey on their hardtack biscuits. Tank crews in North Africa sweetened their coffee with honey. Sailors in the Atlantic spread honey on their bread. Medics used honey-soaked bandages to treat wounds when proper antibiotics weren't available. But to truly understand the impact, you need to hear the stories of the soldiers themselves. In June of 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, a Marine corporal named Thomas Hernandez spent 4 days pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire on a rocky hillside. His unit's supply line had been cut. They had ammunition and water, barely, but no food. When a supply drop finally reached them on the 5th day, among the sea rations and ammunition was a 5-gallon can of honey that had split open during the drop, spilling its golden contents across the rocks. Hernandez and his fellow Marines scooped up that honey with their fingers, mixing it with canteen water to make a crude but desperately needed energy drink. Years later, in an interview recorded for a Veterans History project, Hernandez said that honey might have saved his life. Not dramatically, not like a medic pulling him from the line of fire, but simply by giving him the calories and energy he needed to keep functioning when his body was shutting down from exhaustion and hunger. In North Africa, during the brutal desert campaigns of 1942 and 1943, honey proved invaluable for a different reason. The heat was incredible, often reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Chocolate melted into unusable sludge. Hard candies fused together into sticky masses. Sugar absorbed moisture from the air and turned into concrete like blocks. But honey, properly sealed in its cans, remained stable and usable. More importantly, when water was scarce and troops were suffering from dehydration, honey could be mixed with the limited water supplies to provide both hydration and calories in a single drink. Army medics discovered that soldiers suffering from heat exhaustion responded better when given water mixed with honey rather than water alone. The glucose and fructose in honey were absorbed rapidly, helping to restore blood sugar levels that had crashed during prolonged exertion in extreme heat. On the Eastern Front, where American supplies were being shipped to Soviet forces under the Lend-Lease program, honey became a prized commodity for Russian soldiers fighting in conditions of unimaginable hardship. The winter of 1942 to 1943, during the Battle of Stalingrad, saw temperatures drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Most foods froze solid. Canned goods had to be thawed before they could be eaten, wasting precious fuel. But honey, due to its high sugar concentration, remained fluid even in sub-zero temperatures. Russian soldiers would eat it directly from the can, getting quick energy without the need for heating. Soviet military physicians also used American honey extensively in treating frostbite and battlefield wounds. The combination of cold temperatures, which slow bacterial growth, and honey's natural antimicrobial properties created an effective treatment protocol that helped prevent infections and amputations. Soviet medical reports from the period noted that honey-treated wounds had significantly lower infection rates compared to wounds treated with available antiseptics, many of which were in short supply. In the Pacific Theater, honey served yet another crucial purpose: treating tropical ulcers. These chronic, infected sores were caused by a combination of factors: minor wounds that became infected in the humid jungle environment, poor nutrition, constant exposure to moisture, and the presence of numerous bacterial and fungal pathogens. Tropical ulcers could disable a soldier as effectively as a bullet wound, and they were maddeningly difficult to treat with the limited medical supplies available in forward areas. Field hospitals in New Guinea, the Philippines, and other Pacific islands began using honey dressings for tropical ulcers after conventional treatments failed. The results were remarkable. Ulcers that had resisted weeks of treatment with sulfur drugs and traditional antiseptics would begin healing within days when treated with honey. The honey appeared to work through multiple mechanisms, killing bacteria, reducing inflammation, promoting the growth of new tissue, and creating a protective barrier against further contamination. Navy corpsmen and Army medics started requesting honey specifically for wound treatment, sometimes bypassing the official supply channels to trade for it with other units. A can of honey could be worth its weight in morphine or penicillin in some forward bases, simply because it was so effective at treating the kinds of wounds and infections that were most common in jungle warfare. Pilots and aircrew had their own experiences with honey. Long-range bombing missions over Germany or Japan could last 8 to 12 hours. Crews were flying in unpressurized aircraft at altitudes where temperatures dropped far below zero. They were wearing electrically heated flight suits that sometimes failed. They were breathing oxygen through masks. They were under constant stress, watching for enemy fighters, operating complex equipment, trying to hit targets while flak exploded around them. The Army Air Forces developed special high-altitude ration kits for bomber crews. These kits included honey in squeezable tubes, similar to toothpaste tubes, that could be consumed through the side of an oxygen mask without removing it. The honey provided quick energy, helped maintain blood sugar levels during the long missions, and didn't freeze solid at high altitude the way many other foods did. Bomber crews swore by their honey tubes. They would carefully ration them throughout a mission, taking a squeeze every hour or so to maintain their energy and focus. Some crews developed superstitious rituals around their honey, refusing to fly without it, convinced it brought them luck as much as nutrition. After the war, when veterans were interviewed about their experiences, honey came up surprisingly often in their stories. Not as the most important thing they remembered, certainly, but as one of those small comforts that made an unbearable situation slightly more bearable. It was familiar, it tasted like home, and in situations where so much was strange and terrible and frightening, that familiarity mattered more than anyone who hasn't been in combat can truly understand. Beeswax, another product of the hive, proved equally valuable. The military found over 350 different applications for beeswax. It was used to waterproof ammunition, protecting bullets and shells from moisture in jungle environments. It was used to coat canvas tents, keeping soldiers dry in the rain. It was used to lubricate cables and pulleys on ships and aircraft. It was used in adhesive tape, varnishes, even in certain electronics. Practically all types of ammunition were coated with beeswax, from rifle cartridges to 16-inch naval shells. Beeswax didn't expand in desert heat or crack in polar cold, making it ideal for military applications across every theater of war. But the applications went far beyond what most people realize. Military engineers discovered that beeswax was the perfect material for dozens of problems they faced in the field. Consider aircraft maintenance. Planes operating in the Pacific had to deal with salt spray from the ocean, which corroded metal parts with terrifying speed. Beeswax-based protective coatings could be applied to exposed metal surfaces, creating a barrier that prevented salt water from reaching the metal underneath. Ground crews on aircraft carriers and island bases would spend hours carefully waxing critical components, engine parts, control cables, hydraulic fittings, anything that couldn't be completely sealed but needed protection from the corrosive marine environment. In cold weather operations, beeswax solved different problems. Rubber gaskets and seals would become brittle and crack in extreme cold, causing fuel leaks, oil leaks, and equipment failures that could ground aircraft or disable vehicles. By treating rubber components with specific beeswax formulations, military mechanics could keep gaskets flexible at temperatures that would normally destroy them. This was particularly critical during the brutal winter campaigns in Italy and later in Germany, where Allied forces were operating in mountainous terrain at high altitudes in sub-zero temperatures. Ammunition waterproofing was perhaps the single most important application. A bullet that gets wet might still fire, but its accuracy and reliability are compromised. A mortar shell that absorbs moisture might not detonate properly. Artillery shells loaded with wet powder could explode prematurely in the barrel, killing the gun crew. In the Pacific, where soldiers might spend days or weeks wading through swamps, crossing rivers, and fighting in monsoon rains, keeping ammunition dry was a matter of life and death. The military's solution was elegant. Coat every single round, every single shell, with a thin layer of beeswax. The wax was applied hot, so it flowed into every crevice and created a complete seal. When the ammunition was needed, the wax coating didn't interfere with firing. It would be either scraped off by the weapon's action or simply vaporized by the heat of combustion. But until that moment, it kept water out completely. Factories in the United States processed millions of pounds of beeswax specifically for ammunition coating. The scale of the operation was staggering. During peak production in 1944, American ammunition plants were coating over 100 million rounds per month. That required approximately 500,000 pounds of beeswax per month just for ammunition. Add in all the other military applications, canvas waterproofing, cable lubrication, protective coatings, medical supplies, and American beekeepers were producing close to 10 million pounds of beeswax annually for military use alone. This was on top of the honey production, and all of it depended on having hives that could be managed efficiently, that produced consistent yields, that could be inspected for disease and maintained in good health. All of it depended on Langstroth's movable frame design. Consider what would have happened without that design. Traditional beekeeping methods, where you killed the bees and crushed the comb to extract honey, also destroyed the wax in the process. You could collect it, certainly, by melting down the crushed comb and straining out the impurities. But the yield was poor, the quality was inconsistent, and the process was labor-intensive. With Langstroth hives and modern extraction methods, beeswax became a valuable byproduct that could be collected, processed, and sold separately from the honey. When beekeepers cut away old comb to make room for new frames, that old comb was saved. When they extracted honey using centrifugal extractors, any capping wax, the thin layer of wax the bees used to seal honey cells, was collected. When they found old, damaged, or diseased comb that needed to be replaced, it was melted down and processed. All of this wax, which in the old days would have been mixed with honey and lost to inefficient processing, was now a separate, valuable product stream. The beekeeping industry had established wax rendering plants that would accept wax from hundreds or thousands of beekeepers, process it into uniform blocks or sheets, and sell it to manufacturers. When the war started and the military began demanding vast quantities of beeswax, this infrastructure was already in place. It just needed to be scaled up and redirected toward military production. The government offered premium prices for beeswax that met military specifications, clean, free from contaminants, with specific melting points and chemical properties. Beekeepers responded by being more careful about wax collection and processing. What had been a minor sideline, selling a few pounds of wax to candle makers or furniture polish manufacturers, became a significant revenue stream that helped keep beekeeping operations profitable even when honey prices were controlled by government contracts. This economic reality was important. Because keeping beekeepers in business, keeping them expanding their operations, keeping them motivated to produce as much as possible, that required more than just patriotic appeals. It required economic incentives that made beekeeping worthwhile. The government understood this. They set honey and beeswax prices high enough to ensure profitability. They provided assistance with equipment purchases. They exempted beekeepers from certain wartime restrictions that affected other agricultural producers. They even helped arrange labor when beekeepers' sons and workers were drafted. In some cases, experienced beekeepers were given agricultural deferments, excused from military service because their work producing honey and beeswax was considered more valuable than their potential service as soldiers. This was controversial, understandably. Young men who desperately wanted to serve their country were instead told to stay home and tend bees. But the government's calculus was clear. One experienced beekeeper managing 500 hives could produce 25,000 pounds of honey and 2,000 pounds of beeswax per year. That honey could feed hundreds of soldiers. That beeswax could waterproof the ammunition they needed to fight. The mathematics of total war are cold and unforgiving, but they are also undeniable. But most Americans never knew any of this. They saw the honey disappear from store shelves and grumbled about rationing, not understanding that their sacrifice was helping to keep soldiers alive halfway around the world. The beekeepers themselves often had no idea where their product ended up. They filled barrels and cans, loaded them onto trucks, and watched them drive away. No acknowledgement, no thanks, no indication that it mattered. Just the steady hum of bees, the endless work of extraction and processing, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, it was making a difference. The disconnect between the vital work being done and the recognition it received was total. Newspapers ran stories about factory workers building tanks and ships, celebrating their contribution to the war effort. Radio programs featured dramatic accounts of battles and heroes. Movies depicted soldiers and sailors fighting bravely against impossible odds. But beekeepers? They got nothing. No stories, no recognition, no public acknowledgement that their work mattered. Part of this was simple ignorance. Most Americans, even most soldiers, had no idea how important honey and beeswax were to military operations. They consumed the honey without thinking about where it came from. They fired ammunition coated with beeswax without knowing what kept it dry. They benefited from thousands of small applications of bee products without ever connecting those benefits to the farmers back home managing hives. But part of it was also the nature of agricultural work. Farming, beekeeping, all the essential work of producing food and raw materials, it's not dramatic, it doesn't make for good stories. There's no climactic moment, no heroic sacrifice, just day after day of patient, careful work. A beekeeper checking hives in July of 1943, sweating in the Iowa heat, making sure the colonies are healthy and productive, is contributing as much to the war effort as a factory worker riveting steel plates onto a ship hull. But the factory worker's contribution is visible, tangible, dramatic. You can see the ship taking shape. You can imagine it carrying troops to battle. You can understand the direct connection between the work and the outcome. The beekeeper's contribution is invisible. The honey produced today might not reach a soldier for 6 months. It might end up in a field ration kit in Burma, or a Navy galley in the South Pacific, or a field hospital in France. There's no way to trace it, no way to know. So the beekeepers worked in obscurity, as they always had, as they always would. They worked through the spring honey flow, extracting supers full of nectar that bees had gathered from millions of flowers. They worked through the summer, checking for disease, replacing queens, splitting colonies, managing swarms. They worked through the fall, preparing hives for winter, feeding sugar water to colonies that needed extra stores, making sure everything was ready for the cold months ahead. They worked through the winter, doing maintenance on equipment, repairing hive boxes, building new frames, planning for the next season. And then spring came again, and the cycle repeated. For 4 years, 4 years of war, 4 years of expanded production, 4 years of government contracts and rationing and uncertainty about when, if ever, it would end. The fighting didn't end quickly. The war dragged on for 4 long years. Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Atlantic, Every theatre demanded more men, more equipment, more supplies, and more food. The honey kept flowing, the bees kept working. And Lorenzo Langstroth's invention, that simple wooden box with its precisely spaced frames, continued to prove its worth in ways he never could have imagined. Think about the scale of what was accomplished. From December 1941 to August 1945, a period of 45 months, American beekeepers produced approximately 800 million pounds of honey. 800 million pounds. That's enough to provide roughly 50 pounds of honey to every American soldier who served during World War II. It's enough to fill 160,000 5-gallon containers, which, if stacked, would create a tower over 3 miles high. It represents the work of over 20 billion individual bees, visiting approximately 400 billion flowers, flying a cumulative distance that would take them to the sun and back twice. All of it coordinated, managed, facilitated by human beekeepers using hives designed by a man who had died nearly 50 years before the war began. The numbers are so large they become almost meaningless. But break it down to individual stories and it becomes real. That can of honey that Marine Corporal Hernandez and his squad scooped off the rocks on Saipan, it might have come from hives in South Dakota, managed by a 60-year-old beekeeper named Harold Schmidt, whose 3 sons were all serving overseas. Schmidt got up every morning at 5 a.m., worked his hives until noon, came in for lunch, went back out until dark, 6 days a week, all summer long. He produced 30,000 pounds of honey in 1944. He sent every pound to the government, at government prices, because he knew his boys were out there somewhere and they needed whatever he could give them. One of those boys came home. 2 didn't. That tube of honey the B-17 crew carried on their missions over Germany, it might have come from hives in California, managed by a commercial operation run by a family named Martinez. They had been in the beekeeping business for 3 generations, but never on the scale they achieved during the war. They went from 300 hives in 1941 to over 2,000 by 1944. They hired women to work the hives when all the men were drafted. They taught teenagers how to extract honey and process wax. They turned their operation into a small factory, producing honey and beeswax 7 days a week for the duration of the war. After the war, they couldn't sustain that scale. They sold off most of their equipment, gave up their temporary locations, went back to a manageable size. But for those 4 years, they were part of the machine that kept America's military fed and functioning. Those honey-soaked bandages that Navy corpsmen used to treat tropical ulcers in the Philippines. The honey might have come from hives in Florida, managed by an African-American beekeeper named James Washington. Washington had learned beekeeping from his grandfather, who had been enslaved and who had kept bees using traditional methods, hollow logs and skeps. Washington had bought his first Langstroth hives in 1920, saved for years to afford them, and had built his operation slowly over 2 decades. When the war came, he was managing 150 hives, producing good honey from the tupelo trees in the Florida swamps. The government's honey purchasing program didn't discriminate. They bought honey from anyone who could produce it, regardless of race. For Washington, the war years were the first time he received a fair price for his product, the first time he was treated as an equal partner in a national effort. He produced 15,000 pounds of honey during the war. Some of it perhaps ended up treating the wounds of white soldiers who might never have spoken to him as an equal back home. But the honey didn't care about race or prejudice. It just healed wounds, provided energy, sustained life. These stories, and millions more like them, are the real legacy of wartime beekeeping. Not abstract numbers or statistics, but individual people, doing work they believed in, contributing to something larger than themselves, using tools and techniques that had been developed by a troubled minister in Philadelphia nearly a century earlier. The turning point came not with any single battle, but with the slow, grinding certainty that America could outproduce its enemies. The factories, the farms, the beekeepers, all of them working together, ensured that American soldiers were the best fed, best equipped, and best supplied fighting force in the world. By 1944, the tide had turned. Allied forces invaded Normandy. The Japanese were being pushed back across the Pacific. Victory, once a distant hope, now seemed inevitable. The honey production continued. Even in 1945, as the war in Europe ended in May and the war in the Pacific ended in August, beekeepers maintained their expanded operations. They had proven that American agriculture could meet any challenge, could feed not just a nation but an entire alliance, could sustain a war effort that spanned the globe. The question now was, what would happen next? Would honey production collapse back to pre-war levels? Would the expanded operations fail when government contracts ended and sugar rationing was lifted? Would all the work, all the investment in new equipment and new colonies, all the lessons learned about large-scale commercial beekeeping, would it all be lost? The answer, surprisingly, was no. The war had transformed American beekeeping in ways that would prove permanent. Before the war, most beekeepers operated on a relatively small scale. A few hundred hives was considered a large operation. Most were hobbyists or part-time producers who kept bees as a sideline to their main farming operations. The war forced a professionalization of the industry. To meet government demands, beekeepers had to think bigger, operate more efficiently, adopt new technologies and practices. They had to treat beekeeping as a serious business rather than a hobby. That transformation didn't reverse when the war ended. In fact, it accelerated, because while sugar rationing ended and civilian demand for honey declined somewhat, something else emerged that would transform beekeeping even more profoundly than wartime demand for honey ever had: the need for pollination services. American agriculture was changing. Small, diverse family farms were giving way to large-scale commercial operations growing single crops across thousands of acres. This kind of monoculture farming was incredibly productive, but it created a problem. When you have 10,000 acres of almonds all blooming at the same time, where do the pollinators come from? Wild bees can't provide enough pollination for that kind of scale. You need managed honeybee colonies, and lots of them. In California alone, almond growers would eventually need over 1 million bee colonies every February just to pollinate their orchards. That's more bee colonies than exist in many entire countries. And it's just for almonds. Just for 1 month. Add in all the other crops that need pollination: apples, cherries, blueberries, cranberries, melons, cucumbers, pumpkins, and you're looking at a massive, ongoing demand for bee colonies. This demand would eventually exceed the value of honey production. Modern commercial beekeepers make more money renting their hives for pollination than they do selling honey. But none of it would have been possible without the infrastructure and knowledge base that was built up during World War II. The war forced beekeepers to figure out how to manage thousands of hives efficiently. It forced them to develop systems for transporting hives long distances. It forced them to improve their understanding of bee health, genetics, and management. All of those skills, all that knowledge, all that infrastructure, it transferred directly into the post-war pollination industry. When victory finally came, when the celebrations filled American cities with ticker tape and jubilation, few people thought about the bees. Few remembered that Langstroth's invention had made it all possible. The soldiers came home, the factories converted back to civilian production, the sugar rationing ended. And slowly, quietly, without fanfare or recognition, beekeepers returned to their normal operations. But the honey industry never forgot, because they knew. They knew that without the movable frame hive, without the ability to scale up production, without the efficiency and productivity that Langstroth's design had enabled, they never could have met the demand. They never could have supplied the military with the millions of pounds of honey it needed. They never could have contributed to victory in the way they did. In 1949, Congress passed the Agricultural Act, which included price supports for honey producers. The legislation acknowledged that honey production, and by extension beekeeping, was essential to national security. The program was designed to ensure that sufficient honeybee colonies would always be available for crop pollination and, if needed, for wartime honey production. It was one of the few times the government explicitly recognized the strategic importance of an agricultural product that most people considered a mere luxury. But there was no medal for Lorenzo Langstroth, no monument to the father of American beekeeping at the war memorials, no mention in the history books of how his invention, created nearly a century before the war, had helped sustain millions of soldiers. Just silence, the quiet hum of bees, the patient work of beekeepers, and the knowledge, shared among those who understood, that sometimes the most important contributions are the ones nobody sees. A legacy measured in frames, not fanfare. The years after the war saw American beekeeping continue to evolve and expand. The Langstroth hive remained the standard, with minor modifications and improvements, but always retaining the essential principle of bee space. By the 1960s and 70s, commercial beekeeping had become a sophisticated industry, with operations managing thousands of hives, moving them across the country to follow blooming crops, providing pollination services worth millions of dollars. The honey was almost secondary to the value of pollination. But the foundation of it all, the thing that made it all possible, was still Langstroth's invention. In 1976, Langstroth Cottage, his home in Oxford, Ohio, where he lived from 1858 to 1887, was designated a National Historic Landmark. It was one of the first recognitions of his contribution outside the beekeeping community. The cottage, a simple 2-story, 8-room house, stood as a quiet testament to the man who had revolutionized an industry while battling his own inner demons. Today, it houses an office, unassuming, ordinary, visited by few people who aren't specifically looking for it. In 2007, 70 years after his death, Lorenzo Langstroth was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, alongside Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and the Wright brothers. The citation recognized his invention of the modern beehive and its impact on agriculture and food production. But even this recognition came with a certain irony, because Langstroth himself never profited from his invention, never saw it celebrated in his lifetime, never knew that it would one day be considered one of the most important agricultural innovations in American history. The National Inventors Hall of Fame estimated that 75% of all beehives in use today are based on Langstroth's design. In the United States, that percentage is even higher. Walk past any commercial apiary, any backyard beekeeper's operation, any farm that keeps bees for pollination, and you'll see the same basic design: rectangular wooden boxes, stacked vertically, with frames suspended inside, all maintaining that crucial bee space that Langstroth discovered 173 years ago. The numbers are staggering. The United States currently has approximately 2.7 million managed honeybee colonies. These colonies produce over 160 million pounds of honey each year. They provide pollination services valued at over $18 billion annually. 1/3 of the American food supply depends on insect pollination, primarily by honeybees. None of this, absolutely none of it, would be possible without the movable frame hive, without bee space, without Lorenzo Langstroth's moment of insight in the summer of 1851. And while he never knew it, while he died thinking himself a failure who had accomplished little beyond feeding his own family and fighting his own battles with depression, his invention helped feed millions. It helped win a war. It helped transform agriculture. The bees didn't care about any of that, of course. They just kept working, building comb, storing honey, raising brood, doing what they had done for millions of years before humans ever thought to manage them. But humans cared. The beekeepers who used Langstroth hives, who understood what he had given them, they cared. The soldiers who ate honey in foxholes and on ships, who sweetened their coffee with it, who used it to treat their wounds, they might not have known who Lorenzo Langstroth was, but they benefited from his invention nonetheless. There's something almost poetic about it. A man who spent his life fighting darkness, who found solace in the ordered world of the hive, who created something beautiful and functional while his own mind threatened to tear him apart, ultimately contributed to saving lives on a scale he could never have imagined. His invention didn't kill anyone. It didn't destroy anything. It simply made it easier for bees to do what they do naturally, and in doing so, it made it possible for humans to benefit from that work on an unprecedented scale. It's easy to think of war as a contest of weapons, of tanks and planes and bombs, but it's also a contest of logistics, of food and fuel and supplies. It's about keeping millions of soldiers fed, healthy, and functional across vast distances and in the most challenging environments on Earth. And sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat comes down to something as simple as honey, produced by bees living in hives designed by a troubled minister who just wanted his insects to be comfortable. Lorenzo Langstroth never stormed a beach. He never fired a shot. He never commanded troops or planned battles. But his honey, produced by the millions of pounds in hives based on his design, travelled to every theatre of World War II. It crossed the Atlantic to England and Europe. It crossed the Pacific to islands whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. It went to North Africa, to Italy, to the Philippines. It fed soldiers who were cold, who were hungry, who were far from home and wondering if they would ever see their families again. And it did something that almost nothing else in war ever does. It gave comfort without taking life. It sustained without destroying. It helped without harming. There's something profoundly American, profoundly human in that idea, that in the middle of the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, one man's simple invention, created 90 years earlier to make beekeeping less destructive and more humane, could tip the balance in favor of those fighting for freedom. A wooden box with movable frames became a tool of war, but a gentle one, a kind one that saved lives instead of ending them. So maybe it's worth asking, how many other small inventions, how many other quiet contributions have we forgotten? How many wars were nudged not by grand strategies but by simple solutions? How many lives were saved by people who never sought recognition, who just wanted to solve a problem or ease a burden? Lorenzo Langstroth would have been mortified by any suggestion that he was a hero. He saw himself as a failed minister, a man broken by mental illness, who had found refuge in beekeeping and had made a small contribution to that field. He died thinking his invention had been stolen, that he had gained nothing from it, that his life had been marked more by failure than success. But he was wrong, because long after he was gone, his invention continued to work. It continued to spread. It continued to make life better for both bees and humans. It helped feed a nation at war. It helped build an industry. It helped create the modern agricultural system that feeds billions of people today. And it all started with 3/8 of an inch. A gap just wide enough for a bee to walk through. A space that bees, in their ancient wisdom, knew to leave open. And one man's decision to notice that space, to measure it, to understand it, and to build an entire system around it. That's the power of observation. That's the power of curiosity. That's the power of taking the time to understand the natural world and work with it rather than against it. Langstroth didn't force the bees to do anything. He didn't try to change their behavior or bend them to his will. He simply observed what they were already doing and created a tool that made it easier for both the bees and the beekeeper. That's genius. Not the flashy kind that gets celebrated in its own time, but the quiet kind that changes everything without anyone noticing. The kind that lasts centuries. The kind that saves lives. Today, if you visit Woodland Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio, you can find Lorenzo Langstroth's grave. The stone is simple but dignified, marked with the words, "Father of American Beekeeping." Nearby, you might hear the sound of bees visiting flowers, doing their work, indifferent to the man buried beneath the earth. They don't know who he was. They don't know what he did for them. They just keep working, as they always have, as they always will, but we know. The beekeepers know. The historians who take the time to look beyond the generals and politicians know. And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the sweetest part of history is the part we almost missed. Sometimes the most important contributions are the ones that happen quietly, in small workshops and backyard apiaries, made by people who aren't trying to change the world but who end up doing exactly that. Lorenzo Langstroth changed beekeeping forever. He changed agriculture forever. And in a way he never could have predicted, he changed warfare forever, by ensuring that millions of soldiers in the greatest conflict in human history had access to one of nature's most perfect foods, produced efficiently and humanely because of his simple, elegant invention. The bees are still working, the frames are still movable, the honey is still flowing, and somewhere, in whatever peace finally found him, perhaps Lorenzo Langstroth knows that his life, that life he thought was marked by failure, actually mattered more than he ever imagined. Because he gave the world something good, something that lasted, something that helped. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for? So here's my question to you, and I want you to really think about this. What small innovation are you working on right now that might ripple forward through time? What simple idea are you refining that could help people you'll never meet, in ways you can't even predict? What problem are you solving today, not for glory or recognition, but just because it needs solving, because you see a better way? Take a moment. Think about it. Then leave your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one. And your quiet work, your small contribution, your careful observation might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story surprised you, if it made you see history differently, if it reminded you that the most important work often happens in the quietest places, then share it, pass it on. Because Lorenzo Langstroth's story deserves to be remembered, and maybe, just maybe, your story does too.